May God challenge us through that this morning.
Thanks, Megan. It's been a great morning so far. Welcome to those who are back with our community after being away for a while. It's good to have you here. Who's heard this passage? Let's be honest. Who's heard this passage before? I imagine it's quite a well-known passage. It's interesting, that one of the most compelling and possibly well-known passages and stories of the New Testament is, for many textual critics, a questionable inclusion. If you didn't know that about this passage, some Bibles, it might actually have it in slightly different italics and even a note saying that this isn't always in different versions of the Bible, and certainly certain denominations and church traditions wouldn't be preaching from it even. But I think we've heard messages from it, and we're going to preach from it today. Even though some of the earliest Greek manuscripts don't record it, it was well known in sort of oral history, and I think around the 5th century it was particularly ratified within our sort of tradition dating back to the Catholic Church. But we hear in this story, regardless of all of those textual critics, we hear in this story the truth of the heart of God. The truth of the heart of God. And it might be hard for us to even relate to it in a modern Western context, because the thought of being potentially facing death for adultery in our society is just unheard of, thankfully unheard of. It's a bygone prospect of the ancient reality that they existed in. So it's hard for us sometimes to relate to that reality. But the notions that it kind of depicts, like justice and mercy, law and grace, judgment and forgiveness, are equally valid and vital today as they were in the ancient world. As equally important to understanding who God is today as he was then. And this morning I want you to imagine yourself in the story, if you can. In the story. And I want you to imagine if you were yourself holding a stone. Because whether you want to acknowledge it or not, we all harbour the impulse to judge. It's in our nature. We all harbour the impulse to condemn. It's in our nature. We all carry a stone. The question isn't whether you carry a stone today. The question is, what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with it? Jesus, it says in verse 1 that he comes down from the Mount of Olives. And this detail in itself kind of connects it to time and place, so that we know a time and a place when the story unfolds. And it's also symbolic in some ways that Jesus himself comes down to a place of connecting with the people where they're at. Why did the others go to their homes, as it records, and yet Jesus was at the Mount of Olives? I think in part it's because Jesus goes there to pray. Because prayer for Jesus prepares him for whatever is to come next. The heart of God itself is to commune with the Father. The heart of Christ is to pray. He prayed and then he taught, as the story says. And Jesus taught regularly in the temple courts in the early morning, with many crowding around to hear him. If you can imagine the scene, it's early morning, he's in the temple courts, and many are crowding around him. He's sitting down to teach, as Jesus did. All was going well, all was going as planned, all was going as intended. And then the leaders barge in. The leaders barge in and demand his attention. Within a moment, this scene of teaching as a rabbi was turned into a kangaroo court. Have you heard that before? A kangaroo court. I've never seen kangaroos in court, but I imagine it's pretty disruptive, okay? So it was a kangaroo court. This mob dynamic was unfolding, and even in the law of the day, the process of the day, there was no due process. It was just a spontaneous, impromptu setting. I want to ask you, who's ever been interrupted? You ever been interrupted before? Maybe rudely interrupted, right? Who's been rudely interrupted before? That happens to me at home quite a lot. No, not really. I can say that. My wife's not here. But I imagine it happens to you, that you get rudely interrupted. Sometimes, who's the rude interrupter? Who's ever been the rude interrupter before? I've got something, I'm just going to say it, I'm just going to say it, all right? In God, we can grow through and out of that, hopefully. But what does Jesus do to these rude interrupters? Well, he doesn't react in kind. Jesus doesn't react in kind. There is no knee-jerk reaction. There is no sense of impetuous retort, even though there was plenty to be said. There was no impetuous retort, even though there was plenty to be said. He wasn't misled by the apparent tyranny of the urgent. And what's important to grasp here, that this was no minor problem. This was no minor problem. There was a life or death moment for this woman. This was a life or death moment for this woman. I don't know if anyone's heard of O.J. Simpson before. Heard of O.J. Simpson? The footballer who wasn't convicted. Why? Because the glove didn't fit, Todd. That's right. Not many gloves would fit your hands either, I dare say. The glove didn't fit. Now, if there was ever a time for Johnny Cochran, you know who Johnny was? Johnny was one of his lawyers. If there was ever a time for a Johnny Cochran-style legal defence to rant and rave and rise up in vehement advocacy for this woman, it was now. If there was ever a time for that to happen, it was now. Her life was on the line. And yet Jesus just listens. Jesus just listens and he observes. And even more so, you know what he does? He starts doodling in the dirt. Right? This hostile setting, and Jesus just starts doodling in the dirt. Now, I do that. Sometimes I'll regress if I'm stressed, so I'd probably start doodling in the dirt and just go in the fetal position. But Jesus isn't like that. He just listens, observes, and starts doodling in the dirt. Friends, out of even this observation of that situation, I think in life, we need to be wary in responding to others in the flurry of a moment. We need to be very wary in responding to others in the flurry of a moment. When we're perhaps caught off guard, and this can be as simple as in the relationships that you have at home. You know, if there's something that happens that you didn't expect, just resist the urge to react. We need to listen, we need to observe, we need to discern at work, in church, at home, whatever it is. We need to march to the beat of God's drum and not the demands of others. And that's a tricky thing to do. If there's an urgent need, life or death it seems, it's not easy to march to the beat of God's drum and not the demands of others. And importantly, never rush to judgment. Never rush to judgment. The Pharisees and scribes were seeking to put this woman and Jesus on show in front of everyone. The whole endeavour of shaming this woman publicly, when the same process of complaint could have occurred in private, was appalling. I don't know if that's ever happened to you. Something that should have happened and been dealt with in private, but then gets exposed. It should never have happened, but this was their motives. This is what they were on about. They claimed to have the law on their side, but they betrayed both the letter of the law and the heart of the law. They didn't even get the law right, even though they were claiming it. They certainly missed the heart of the law. You see, in Jewish law and legal process, and you might know this already, but there was this indelible interplay between justice and mercy. Justice and mercy were interplayed all the time. In this scenario, any accusation like this, there had to be two witnesses. Believe it or not, two people who observed this woman doing the deed. Right? That was what the law required. They had to see this woman in the act of adultery. And the accusers had to be willing to mete out the punishment themselves. Such was the weight of truth that they held. If they were going to accuse, and this woman's life was on the line, they had to be willing to mete out the punishment themselves. They had to be the ones, potentially, who would stone her. Or they could forgive the act. They could forgive the act and not cast the first stone. The reflex of the law was always weighted towards mercy. You know, we think in our society that we're evolved, but in this ancient world, this context, this law of Judaism that they had, the reflex of the law, the impulse of the law was always weighted towards mercy. Forgiveness was actually the preferred option. Forgiveness was always the preferred option. When consequences were imposed, it was because legitimate due process and as such true justice was upheld. Sadly, in this situation, none of these things were playing out. There was an apparent contradiction, and one of those contradictions was the man wasn't there. The co-accused wasn't there. By law, both should have been held to account. The potential sentence of death penalty was for both. The man and even the husband involved in this, the victim apparently, he wasn't there either. So three potential scenarios are playing out here for the woman. Either she had committed adultery, either the woman had been raped, and in that context it's hard to know, or the woman was innocent and she was being falsely accused. Whatever the case, the woman wasn't receiving a fair trial. Friends, if you've lived long enough, you'll come to realise that justice by our own hands as people, justice by our own hands is always subjectively skewed and distorted. With the best of intentions as humans, justice is always subjectively skewed. And the Pharisees and scribes were driven by their sinful, covert desires. They were willing to exploit this woman to undermine Jesus. She was disposable, and Jesus was the target. It wasn't about a quest to uphold justice. It was about deceitful condemnation for selfish gain. You could say Jesus was kind of in a rock and a hard place as he doodles in the dirt. If Jesus said yes, that she deserved to be stoned in accordance with Jewish law, that even contravened Roman law, because no one could be held to capital punish without the Romans' approval. So even if he said yes to these Jewish leaders, he was contravening Roman law. If he said no, he would be accused by the Jewish leaders of contravening their law. He was in a rock and a hard place. And today, the tension between upholding justice on one hand and showing mercy on the other plays out every day in our courts. It plays out every day in our schools, in our workplaces, in our churches, and in our families. Every day. How do you uphold morality, the sense of right and wrong, and be compassionate? How do you uphold the sense of right and wrong and be compassionate? How do we neither encourage sin or condemn the sinner? There's always this tension that exists in that space. And ultimately, you know what? We can't. We can't. Not very successful anyway. Not on our own. In the midst of the accusers and their lust for perceived justice, Jesus looks up from his doodling. He stands up, and he weighs in this moment. Jesus knows what's really going on. Behind the charade of false piety of the Pharisees, into this highly charged, volatile situation, people armed. It wasn't like the Israeli militia were coming to Jesus' defense here, or the woman's. People were armed, ready to inflict pain and death. And Jesus says what no one is expecting. He doesn't even give an answer to their question. There was no Johnny on the scene. There was no long apologetic. There was no elaborate argument. Just a profound statement. Whoever is without sin. Whoever is without sin. Whoever is without sin, cast the first stone. I don't know about you, but when you kind of think about that in context, it's a bit of a mic drop moment. And I have got mic drop here, but I'm not going to do that, right? It's a bit of a mic drop moment. Whoever is without sin, cast the first stone. It's a bit of a jaw-dropping moment, a bit of a brain drain from those around them, from raucous cries of stone her, to profound silence in a moment. God has a way of doing that, doesn't he? God has a way of doing that. One by one, the courtyard begins to clear. Talks about, I think, even from the eldest down. Some people come to their senses sooner than others. One by one, the courtyard clears. Now, does that mean that no one can keep another to account? Should sinful actions never be addressed? Not at all. Jesus' emphasis here is actually on personal accountability. That's Jesus' focus, personal accountability. When we come to know that we all fall short, when we come to see and understand the full extent of our own sinfulness, and that the only claim any of us have to the goodness of God is because of the grace of Jesus, then we will all live free from judging others. When you come to know that we all fall short, when we come to see and understand the full extent of our own sinfulness, and that the only claim any of us have to the goodness of God is because of the grace of Jesus, then we will live free from judging others. Matthew 7 talks about why should we look at the speck in another's eye when we've got a log in our own. When Jesus invited the sinless to cast out the first stone, he was simply challenging the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. The passage itself in no way endorses or excuses sin. It's not about permissiveness of sin, but rather the presence of compassion and forgiveness to transform people, each of us, from sin. In verse 11, Jesus actually says to the woman, "Go and sin no more. Go and sin no more." And that was a general comment. Leave your life of sin. It wasn't about the accused act, which may or may not have even occurred. It was about go and sin no more. In your life, be different. live righteously. And he not only calls this woman to a repentant life, to turn, but he says to the Pharisees, do the same. Who can throw the first stone? Who can throw the first stone? He says, go and get your own house in order and show compassion to this woman. Go and get your own house in order and show compassion to this woman. Learn to live in forgiveness and love. In your quest for justice, be merciful. Again, the law, the reflex of the law is mercy. In your quest for justice, be merciful. This was a profoundly teachable moment, friends, for the Pharisees, as it was a life-saving one for the woman. This was a profoundly teachable moment for the Pharisees, as it was a life-saving moment for the one. Jesus writes in the dirt. Have you ever been curious what he writes? Like, what does Jesus doodle? The God of the universe who doodled stars, what does he doodle in the dirt? Incredibly, the same finger that had written the law on the tablets at Mount Sinai, that's what Jesus did. The same finger that wrote the law on the tablets now writes in the sand. So what does he write? Perhaps he was writing the sins of the accusers and the woman in the sand, and they're just wiping them away. Maybe that's what he was doing. We don't actually know, but you know, it doesn't matter what he did write. I think what matters is this idea of a submissive posture. Jesus had this submissive posture. This finger was pointed down. Who's ever been in a situation where they've been in trouble again, and somebody's pointed a finger at you? Who's ever been there before? Somebody's pointed a finger at you. What's your natural reflex to that? Mercy, love. I played football with some of these guys, all right? The ref wasn't pointing a finger, but he was blowing lots of whistles, and not many of us were showing the ref too much mercy at times. But usually when somebody's pointing a finger at you, you feel like acting up, don't you? You feel like pointing one back. Friends, I want to encourage you today. When that kind of stuff begins to happen, it incites anger because it makes us feel belittled. But the call of Jesus on our life is that we don't point fingers. The call of God on our life is that we don't point fingers. And the church, for too long in our history, has been known as a moral police, trying to regulate the world around us based on what we know, as opposed to being the heart of Jesus, which just lives out compassion and love for people who don't know Jesus yet and shouldn't be judged by our standards anyway. The church for too long has been a moral police almost. And Jesus is calling us to be something far grander. Friends, some of us today need to lower our finger of condemnation, whether it's towards ourselves, the world around us, or even one another. We need to lower our finger of condemnation. We need to lay down our stones of judgment. Jesus says to the Pharisees, "He who is without sin cast the first stone," and there was no one. There was no one. They all walked away. Jesus says to the woman, "Your accusers have left. You are free from condemnation. Go and sin no more." Notice when Jesus says that over her life, that she was declared free, and then she was encouraged to go and sin no more. Jesus declares her free. There's no one to accuse you. There is no condemnation for you from others or me. Now go and sin no more. Friends, when we know that we're free in Jesus, because that's what comes first. When you know that you are free in Jesus, free from judgment and condemnation, then you will live faithfully like Jesus. We tend to get it the other way around sometimes. We try and live faithfully to discover freedom. Jesus says you're free. And when you know that to the core of your being, you then live faithfully like Jesus. More than anything else today, and I invite the musos to come. More than anything else today, may our vision and our mission in life to be to help others to come to know this too. To come to know that they are free in Jesus. They don't need to conform. They don't need to be something. They just need to know that they are free in Jesus. And as they discover and embrace that freedom, to live faithfully like him. Friends, may that be our vision and mission for the world around us. Luke 6 puts it like this: "Be merciful just as God your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven." friends, may our church be a place where everyone, whatever background, age, political persuasion, gender, sexual preference, marital status, ethnicity, feels that they are welcomed and loved just as they are, and inspired through the Holy Spirit to live like Jesus. That's the vision that I have for our church. And for many of us, we embody that vision today. We're going to pray in these moments. We're going to worship. I invite you to stand or sit, whatever you feel free to do. If there was an opportunity earlier that you came and you made use of that, that's awesome. If you want to come forward and grab a card again and pray. But my vision, friends, is that we would learn in our own life that very intricate balance between the heart of justice of God and mercy. And the reflex of God and the law is always mercy. May we be a merciful people today. Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you today. I thank you today that you are a God who loves us. I thank you that today that you are a God who is wise and gracious, and in a moment of such a volatile situation, and many of us today face volatile situations, but in the midst of that, God, you listen and you observe. In the midst of that, God, you respond with this profound statement of love. You respond with what we need as a humanity, which is so far beyond often what we expect. And I pray, God, that you would help us to embody that same response, that same heart, that we would be a people of mercy, of grace, and of love. And even when slighted, because for some of us, we have stories of hurt going back weeks, months, and years, where we face a profound injustice. God, help us to forgive. Help us, Lord Jesus, to embrace your mercy, that we might heal and grow, that we might show a world a picture that they're not used to, a picture that they can't predict, a picture that we can't manufacture in our own strength, a picture of your profound mercy and love, which simply says, whoever was without sin, cast the first stone. Jesus, we declare today that we are all sinners. May we become more aware of our true nature and the depth of our need of you. And in these moments, as we sing, as we worship, as we pray, continue to minister to our hearts. May we be a people, may we be a church who walk in freedom and the fullness of God as we endeavour to live like Jesus. This is our heart's prayer for us and those around about us. We ask in your precious and holy name. Friends, in these moments, I invite you to pray. I invite you to come forward if God is leading you into that space. I invite you to sing and worship and encounter afresh the Spirit of God. You know, when those leaders walked away, we don't really know the full extent of that impact. I think they were just frustrated, probably, that they didn't have an answer. But for that woman, we know and believe that she was changed in such a profound way, that she did live differently. That's what Jesus does for each of us. He saves our lives so that we would live differently. Friends, let's worship in these moments and seek his Spirit.